Hi, Spire News. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. We're going to talk a little bit about foreign policy and make our way all the way to frozen pizza, which there is a news item about. I promise you, this is how news broadcasts should work. We're going to cover the tough stuff, but we're also going to cover what's happening in your freezer. Before I get to that, I have to tell you guys, I was thinking about you this morning. I just want to thank you so much. Talking to you about the news is one of the best parts of my day, every day. And I appreciate it so much, and I really consider it a privilege to be able to do this, especially during this particular time in history. So thank you so much for this opportunity. We do have a big story on Capitol Hill that I want to make sure gets your attention beyond what we're talking about related to whether or not the government will stay funded, which is also, of course, a big story that I'll mention to you in just a moment. But we have the nation's top military leaders that are going to be testifying in front of the Senate, a particular Senate Armed Services Committee. And this is the first time that these military leaders will step forward and talk really publicly and answer questions to lawmakers since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And these are all the major players involved. They include General McKenzie. You'll recognize him because you've seen him in a couple of our videos. He is the commander of CENTCOM. Central Command is the area that oversees Afghanistan. Also testifying today will be the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Austin, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. That's General Milley to your right-hand side. So they're going to be answering questions from Republicans and Democrats about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, but there's a host of big stories that are happening. So this is a hearing that I'm going to be watching very closely. This is not a hearing like a court of law. We always have to mention that, although we'll use very similar terms to describe it. But this is a matter of public record, and what is said and how it's discussed, the tone and the substance will really matter when it comes to this particular hearing. So we'll be watching that. In the meantime, now that we're almost exactly a month since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, I wanted to take a look at what's happening there. And we have a couple different stories that we're watching out of Afghanistan. One is the continued meetings between the new government that is run by the Taliban and foreign leaders. This is a meeting that just happened between one of the high-ranking Taliban officials and the Chinese ambassador. They said that they're talking about humanitarian aid and continued partnership. The reason why I wanted to show you this is that we have to remember that there are other foreign countries that have a presence still in Afghanistan, that are continuing to develop these relationships, even though the United States is not present there. The United States continues to weigh in on issues in Afghanistan. For example, there's been a lot of coverage about the law that's going to be put in place, the interpretation of Islamic law that the Taliban are going to enforce that includes amputations and executions. This is something that we've seen from the Taliban in the past. This is apparently something that's going to be continued to be enforced. The U.S. says this, it violates human rights, but what is the leverage that we currently have when it comes to the Taliban government is a big question moving forward, and certainly one that we'll be watching to see if any of the military leadership answer. That's also very much a political question, a diplomatic question. So some of what the military leaders will have to respond to is about the way that the United States evacuated from Afghanistan, and not what it just means for Afghanistan right now, but also the message that it sends to the world. And this is why I wanted to mention this NBC report. You get a lot of reports from anonymous sources coming out ahead of these hearings because people are trying to plant stories to get lawmakers to ask about this. So this is based on anonymous sources. You should know that. But this is an NBC report that says the United States says to the Taliban, do not come into Kabul. If you move new forces into Kabul, we are going to strike these forces. Apparently, the Taliban didn't heed that, went into Kabul, and there were no airstrikes. And so the question that comes up here is, again, about military leadership. So we'll be watching what's happening in this particular hearing today. And of course, I'll grab any sound bites that I think are particularly important for you to see. This is also a reminder of just how much business actually gets done on Capitol Hill. Sometimes it doesn't feel like that, right? And of course, we're talking about the government ability to stay funded. And what's really important to know, we mentioned that Thursday is the deadline where we could basically shut down the government if there's no agreement on a spending plan. But a lot has to happen in the hours leading up to that deadline to even make an option possible. And I just want to remind you of this. We've been throwing out the term, $3.5 trillion spending bill, and that's what the Democrats want. But it's really up to lawmakers to decide what a final bill looks like. They have complete creativity if they want it, and if they have the political will. So they have the opportunity to negotiate further. Democrats, though, have the majority in the House and the Senate. And so there are two Democrat senators Senator Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Sinema of Arizona, who are the two senators that say this, and they're Democrats, this spending bill is too big. If Democrats are able to recruit these two to basically their side, if you will, then they're going to be able to pass the bill that they want. If they can't, then they're at this standoff, and this standoff will continue. There's not, just a little political analysis, there's not a lot of incentive for Republicans to negotiate, because Republicans are saying, well, hey, you guys have the majority in the House and the Senate. It's up to you to figure this out. And politically, the Biden administration has been wading through a lot of really big controversies. You've seen these big news stories, what's happening at the border, what's happening with COVID-19, what happened in Afghanistan. And now this is supposed to be the signature legislation by Democrats. The question is, are they able to actually maneuver it somehow through? There are a lot of options. You can do these temporary, government funding bills. You could try to figure out how to just sort of move the ball a little bit. So we're going to be watching. I think today is particularly important because of that, because they have to do something. They got to get something kind of moving to avert this government shutdown. So I'll be watching what's happening in Washington, D.C. Lawmakers and the pressure from lawmakers, sometimes it's easy to kind of shrug it off in these jokes like, what are these guys doing? But apparently it was the pressure from lawmakers that may have deterred Facebook from launching this Instagram platform for kids. Have you heard about this? Okay, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper report on this, because I really want to break down what is the intention from Facebook, what is going on. The announcement from Instagram just over the last 24 hours is that they're going to pause launching this platform for tweens. And this is really coming after a report, an exclusive report in the Wall Street Journal about Facebook and some internal documents that shows that Facebook, which owns Instagram, by the way, knows that some of what their platform is doing is damaging to kids. So lawmakers, attorneys general across a multitude of states was really putting pressure on Facebook because of this. So I want to do a little bit more of a dive for you on that. I think it's a really interesting story. In the meantime, TikTok was talking about passing like 1 billion users a month. So, it's always the next thing, the next platform for kids or for all of us that we have to watch out for. Okay, final thing about pizza. I told you we'd get there eventually. I don't know about you when it comes to my kids and cooking dinner. A couple times a week, it might be frozen pizza. I try to say one time, but sometimes it can be more than that. This particular part, pizza from DiGiorno, pepperoni, crispy pan, apparently includes other meats potentially in it. And so there's been a big recall. It's something like, we're talking about thousands and thousands of pounds of pizza being recalled because of this. No one's had an adverse reaction, but apparently there's soy in with that meat pizza. And so if you have a soy allergy, you should know about that. But it's just one example of recalls. So I went and looked. I was just curious, how many recalls happen every year? Well, last year I think it was around 30 was the number that I was able to find. But if you look at previous years, it's more than 120. So last year during the pandemic, during the shutdown, during a lot of supply issues, there were less reports of recalls for any number of reasons, from salmonella to having the wrong ingredients. I thought that was sort of an interesting thing that I didn't think anything about when it came to, how 2020 was a different year in so many ways. So if you had that pizza in your freezer, just word to the wise. I think it's an important story to know. I always follow that stuff. Like, do I have any of that? Maybe. There's a lot in my freezer. I don't even know how far to dig back there. All right, guys. Questions and comments. Let me know. We'll be watching the Senate hearing in the Armed Services Committee. That'll be really important. And we have a couple other stories they're like cakes in the oven. They're just about bakes, but you got to just get them across the finish line. All right. Questions and comments. Let me know. And as always, more on smartnews.com. Have a great day.